The ice cracked like a gunshot across the frozen river, and within a heartbeat the horse named Shadow was fighting for his life. Clara Whitfield heard the sound before she saw what caused it. She had been walking along the ridge above the valley, checking the fence line her father had asked her to repair before the next storm rolled in. The morning was bitter cold, the kind of cold that turned breath into fog and made every sound travel further than it should. When the crack echoed off the mountains, she froze in place, her heart hammering. Then she heard the scream. Not a human scream, but the terrified cry of an animal in danger. She knew that sound. Every rancher in the valley knew that sound, because it meant something was dying, or about to. She ran. Her boots slipped on the icy path as she scrambled down the slope toward the river, her breath coming in ragged bursts. When she reached the bend where the water usually moved slow and lazy, she stopped dead. Her stomach dropped. Shadow, her father's prized horse, the one he had raised since it was a foal, the one the whole ranch depended on for work in the fields, was trapped in the middle of the frozen river. The ice around him had shattered into jagged plates, and he was sinking, his powerful legs thrashing uselessly against the freezing water that pulled him down inch by inch. Clara's scream tore through the valley. "Somebody help! Shadow's in the river!" Her voice carried across the fields, and within minutes, people began to appear. Neighbors from the nearby farms, drawn by the sound of her cries, came running with whatever they could grab. Ropes, blankets, anything that might help. But as they gathered at the safe edge of the riverbank, a terrible truth became clear to everyone standing there. There was nothing they could do. The ice near Shadow was too thin, too broken, too dangerous. Anyone who tried to walk out onto it would fall through just as he had. The horse was too far from the bank to reach with a rope, and the current beneath the ice was strong enough to pull a grown man under in seconds. Clara's father, Harold Whitfield, arrived moments later, his face pale with fear. He had built this ranch with his own hands, had trained Shadow himself, had trusted the horse to carry his daughter safely across these very fields 100 times. Now he stood at the edge of the frozen river, helpless, watching the animal he loved fight a battle it could not win alone. "Shadow!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Hold on, boy, hold on." The horse's eyes were wide with terror, his nostrils flaring as he gasped for air between desperate attempts to pull himself free. Each movement seemed to weaken the ice further, sending new cracks spreading outward like spiderwebs across the frozen surface. The cold water had already soaked through his coat, and Clara knew, with a sick feeling in her chest, that horses could not survive long in water that cold. Every second mattered. "We need rope!" someone shouted. "Longer rope!" A young farmhand named Daniel Marsh ran back toward the barn, his boots pounding against the frozen ground. He returned minutes later with the longest length of rope the ranch owned, but even that wasn't enough. The distance between the safe ice and where Shadow struggled was simply too great. "If we try to walk out there, we'll fall in too," Harold said, his voice heavy with grief and frustration. "We can't risk more lives." Clara felt tears freezing on her cheeks as she watched Shadow's struggles grow weaker. The horse had stopped thrashing so violently, and that terrified her more than the thrashing ever had. She knew what it meant when an animal stopped fighting. It meant the cold was winning. "There has to be something we can do," she whispered, mostly to herself. More neighbors arrived, drawn by the commotion. A woman named Margaret Ellison brought heavy blankets, thinking they might be able to warm Shadow once he was pulled free, though nobody yet knew how that rescue would happen. A man named Edwin Foster tried to test the ice near the bank with a long wooden pole, but even 10 feet from shore, the ice groaned and cracked under the slightest pressure. "It's no use," Edwin said grimly. "The whole middle of that river is rotten ice. We go out there, we're all in the water." Harold paced along the bank, his hands running through his hair in desperation. He had lost animals before. That was the reality of ranch life, but never like this. Never in front of his daughter. Never with the whole community watching and unable to help. "Dad, look!" Clara suddenly pointed toward the tree line on the far side of the valley. Everyone turned to look. At first, nobody understood what she meant. Then they saw it. A shape moving through the trees, low and quick, its gray and white coat blending with the snow. A wolf. Gasps rippled through the small crowd. Wolves were rare in this valley, though not unheard of. Ranchers had spotted one from a distance a few times over the past winter, always keeping far from the farms, always vanishing before anyone could get a clear look. Some of the older folks in the valley had stories about a lone wolf that had been seen near the ridge for months, always alone, always watching from a distance, never causing trouble. That's not going to help, Edwin muttered. If anything, we need to keep it away from the horse. But something about the wolf's movement made Clara pause. It wasn't circling like a predator sizing up an easy meal. It was moving with purpose, straight toward the river, its head low, its eyes fixed on the struggling horse. "Get back!" Harold shouted, raising the rifle he kept slung over his shoulder for emergencies. "Everyone stay back from the wolf." The wolf ignored the shouting entirely. It reached the edge of the frozen river and stopped, its paws inches from the water's edge. For a long moment, it simply stood there, watching Shadow struggle, its ears pricked forward, its body still. Clara held her breath. The whole crowd fell silent, uncertain what they were witnessing. Was the wolf hunting? Was it waiting for the horse to weaken further before making a move? Every instinct told them to expect the worst. Then the wolf did something none of them expected. It stepped out onto the ice. Not recklessly, not the way a frightened human might dash forward without thinking. It moved slowly, testing each spot with careful, deliberate steps, distributing its weight in a way that seemed almost calculated. The ice held. It took another step, then another, moving further out onto the frozen river toward the horse. "What in the world is it doing?" Margaret whispered. Nobody had an answer. Harold lowered his rifle slightly, his instincts as a protector warring with his growing confusion. Every part of him wanted to stop the wolf, to chase it away from his horse, but another part of him, quieter, more curious, told him to wait and watch. The wolf continued its careful path across the ice, adjusting its route whenever it sensed weakness beneath its paws, circling wide around the most dangerous cracks. It was reading the ice in a way no human could, sensing which parts might hold and which would give way, using instincts sharpened by a lifetime spent surviving in wild, unforgiving terrain. Shadow, exhausted and shivering, seemed to notice the wolf's approach. His eyes widened further, and for a moment, a fresh wave of panic gave him one last burst of strength. He thrashed against the water, trying to pull himself away from the approaching predator, unaware that the animal drawing closer might not be a threat at all. "He's going to spook the horse worse," Daniel said, alarmed. "We need to do something." "Wait," Clara said suddenly, gripping her father's arm. "Just wait. Look at how it's moving. It's not attacking. It's not growling. It's just watching him." The wolf had stopped a few feet from the edge of the broken ice, close enough now that everyone on the bank could see its eyes clearly, sharp and alert, studying Shadow's position, the angle of his body in the water, the direction of the current beneath the ice. For several long seconds, nothing happened. The wolf simply observed, its head tilting slightly, as it assessed the situation, the way an experienced rescuer might study a scene before deciding how to act. Then, carefully, the wolf moved along the edge of the ice, circling around to where a length of rope, Shadow's own halter rope, trailed loose in the freezing water near the horse's head. It reached the rope and, with surprising gentleness, closed its jaws around it. A collective gasp rose from the crowd on the bank. "It's got the rope," Harold breathed, disbelief written across his face. "It's actually got the rope." The wolf began to pull, slowly, carefully. Its powerful legs braced against the ice as it tried to draw the exhausted horse toward a section of thicker, more stable ground. Shadow, still frightened, resisted at first, his instincts telling him to fight against anything pulling at him. But the wolf did not release its grip, did not panic, did not give up, despite the horse's continued struggle. Clara felt her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the extraordinary scene unfold before her. Never in her life had she imagined she would witness something like this. A wild wolf, an animal she had been taught to fear since childhood, risking its own safety to help a drowning horse it had no reason to save. "This can't be real," Margaret whispered, her hand pressed against her chest. But it was real, and the entire valley would soon know it. As the wolf continued its slow, determined effort, the crowd on the bank began to shift from stunned silence into cautious movement. Harold, still gripping his rifle but no longer raising it, began edging along the safer parts of the ice near the shore, testing each step the way the wolf had done, searching for any way he might be able to help from a safer distance. "Dad, be careful," Clara called out, fear rising in her throat at the thought of losing her father to the same icy water that had already claimed so much of the horse's strength. "I'll stay where it's solid," Harold reassured her, though his voice trembled with the tension of the moment. He reached the edge of where the safe ice ended and peered out at the wolf's slow progress, watching as the animal strained against the weight of the horse, refusing to let go of the rope despite the obvious effort it demanded. Minutes passed like hours. The temperature continued to drop as the sun sank lower behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the frozen valley. Every person gathered at the riverbank understood, without needing to say it aloud, that time was the one thing they did not have in abundance. If Shadow did not reach solid ground soon, no rescue, however remarkable, would be enough to save him. The wolf pulled again, straining against the rope, its muscles visible beneath its thick winter coat, as it fought to drag the massive weight of the horse even a few inches closer to safety. Shadow, sensing perhaps for the first time that something was actually trying to help him rather than harm him, began to shift his own efforts, kicking with what remained of his strength in the same direction the wolf was pulling. It was working, slowly, painfully, but it was working. Clara watched with tears streaming down her frozen cheeks, unable to look away from the impossible sight before her. Whatever happened next, she knew she would never forget this moment. The moment an animal everyone feared became the only hope for a life everyone loved. The wolf paused for a brief moment, seeming to catch its breath, its eyes flicking toward the crowd on the bank, as if assessing them too, as if deciding whether they might finally be close enough to help. Then, with renewed effort, it resumed its pull, dragging the rope another precious foot toward the safer ice near shore. "We need more rope," Harold called out. "If we can get close enough, we can throw a line to reach him." Daniel rushed forward with the length of rope they had gathered earlier, coiling it quickly in his hands, as he moved to the edge of the safe ice beside Harold. Both men understood the danger, understood that one wrong step could send them into the same freezing water, threatening to claim the horse's life. But neither of them hesitated. As the wolf continued its slow, exhausting work, pulling Shadow closer with every strained movement, the people of the valley began to realize that they were witnessing something none of them would ever be able to fully explain. An animal born to hunt, to survive on its own terms in a world that offered it nothing but hardship, had chosen instead to fight for the life of a creature it had never met, in freezing water that threatened to take its own life just as easily. The wolf's paws slipped once, twice, on the treacherous ice, and each time the crowd gasped, certain the animal would lose its footing and be pulled into the water alongside the horse. But each time, it regained its balance, adjusted its stance, and continued pulling, refusing to let go of the rope clenched between its teeth. Clara's eyes never left the wolf as it worked. She had grown up hearing stories about wolves as dangerous, as threats to be guarded against, as creatures that lurked at the edges of civilization, waiting for a chance to do harm. Nothing in those stories had prepared her for what she was witnessing now. An act of courage and determination that seemed to defy everything she thought she understood about the natural world. As the light began to fade further and the cold deepened around them, the distance between Shadow and the safety of solid ground had shrunk from an impossible gap to something that might, just might, be within reach. The real test, however, was still to come. The wolf had pulled the rope another foot closer to the stronger ice, but exhaustion was beginning to show in every strained muscle of its body. Its breath came out in heavy white clouds, and its paws, though careful, were beginning to slip more often on the slick surface beneath them. Harold stood at the edge of the safe ice, rope coiled tightly in his hands, watching the impossible rescue continue in front of him. Every instinct told him to rush forward, to do more, but he knew that one wrong step could turn a difficult situation into a tragedy that claimed more than just a horse. "Throw it now," Daniel shouted. He stood a few feet away, ready to help pull if the rope found its mark. Harold shook his head. "Not yet. The distance is still too far. If I miss, we lose our only good length of rope in the water." Clara watched from a few steps back, her hands clenched into tight fists inside her gloves. She had never felt so powerless in her life, watching her father calculate risk while an animal she barely understood fought a battle that seemed impossible to win. The wolf tugged again, and this time Shadow's front legs found something solid beneath the water, a shift in the riverbed, or perhaps a submerged rock, something that gave him just enough leverage to push himself upward. The horse's head rose higher out of the water, and a fresh burst of hope spread through the crowd on the bank. "He's rising," Margaret called out. "Look, he's getting higher." The wolf, sensing the shift in momentum, adjusted its pull, moving to a slightly different angle that seemed to help Shadow gain more leverage against the ice. It was as though the animal understood, in some deep instinctive way, exactly how to help without needing anyone to teach it. Clara found herself stepping closer to the edge of the safe ice, her father's warning voice echoing in her ears, but her feet moving anyway, drawn by an overwhelming need to be closer to the horse she loved. "Clara, stay back," Harold warned, though his eyes never left the scene playing out before him. "I just want to be ready if he needs help," she said, though even she wasn't entirely sure what kind of help she could offer from where she stood. The wolf pulled again, and this time Shadow's front hooves found solid purchase against a ledge of ice beneath the surface, allowing him to push upward with real strength for the first time since the accident began. Water sprayed as he heaved himself forward, and the sound of ice cracking beneath him sent a fresh wave of fear through everyone watching. "The ice is breaking more!" Edwin shouted, backing away instinctively despite being nowhere near the danger himself. But the cracking wasn't spreading toward Shadow, it was spreading away from him, breaking apart the weakened sections behind him as he pushed forward, as though the horse's own movement was clearing a path rather than creating new danger. The wolf continued its steady pull, moving backward now, toward the stronger ice near the shore, guiding Shadow along the path it had already tested and found safe. Every step was deliberate, every movement calculated, and the crowd on the bank watched in stunned silence as the impossible rescue continued to unfold before their eyes. Harold finally saw his opening. The distance between Shadow and the solid ice had shrunk enough that a well-thrown rope might actually reach. "Now," he shouted, and with a powerful motion, he cast the rope out across the ice toward the horse. The rope sailed through the cold air and landed just short of Shadow's head, sliding across the surface, before stopping a few feet away. Clara's heart sank as she watched it fall short, but the wolf, without hesitation, released the halter rope from its jaws and lunged toward the new rope Harold had thrown, gripping it firmly before it could slide any further away. "It understood," Daniel said, his voice filled with disbelief. "It actually understood what we were trying to do." The wolf pulled the new rope back toward Shadow, positioning it near the horse's head so that Harold and Daniel could begin hauling from the safety of the shore. Together, man and wolf worked toward the same goal, though neither could communicate with the other, both driven by the same desperate need to save a life. "Pull," Harold shouted, and Daniel joined him, both men straining against the rope as they tried to help drag the exhausted horse the final stretch toward solid ground. Shadow, feeling the pull from the shore combined with the wolf's continued efforts, found one last surge of strength deep within himself. His powerful legs churned against the water, kicking with everything he had left, as the combined effort of horse, wolf, and men finally began to make real progress. The ice beneath the wolf groaned again, a warning sound that sent chills down every spine on the riverbank. The animal seemed to sense the danger too, its movements becoming quicker, more urgent, as though it understood that time was running out for both itself and the horse it had chosen to save. "It's not safe out there," Margaret cried. "That wolf is going to fall through." Clara watched with her heart in her throat as the wolf continued to work despite the obvious danger, refusing to abandon its efforts, even as the ice cracked and shifted beneath its paws. She had never witnessed such determination in any creature, wild or tame, and she found herself silently pleading for its safety, as fiercely as she prayed for Shadow's. The rope grew taut in Harold and Daniel's hands, as Shadow's body finally began to slide across the surface of the ice, rather than sink through it, the horse's own momentum combining with the pulling from shore to create real, measurable progress toward safety. "Keep pulling!" Harold shouted. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the freezing temperatures surrounding them. Foot by foot, the horse moved closer to solid ground, the wolf still positioned near his head, occasionally nudging at the rope or adjusting its own position to help guide the horse along the safest path across the treacherous ice. Clara noticed something remarkable happening as she watched. Shadow, who moments earlier had been thrashing in blind panic, had grown calmer, his movements more coordinated, as though some part of him understood that the strange creature helping him meant no harm. The horse's eyes, once wide with pure terror, now seemed to track the wolf's movements with something closer to trust. "He's not afraid of it anymore," Clara whispered, mostly to herself, though her father heard her and nodded slowly. equally amazed by what he was witnessing. The crowd on the bank had grown larger as word spread through the valley, more neighbors arriving to see the impossible scene unfolding on the frozen river. Whispers spread through the group, some in disbelief, others already speaking of the story they would tell their children about the night a wolf saved a horse from the ice. But the rescue was far from finished, and the most dangerous moment was still to come. The final stretch of ice between Shadow and solid ground was the thinnest of all, a stretch that had cracked and reformed many times that winter, weak in ways that no eye could fully judge from the shore. Harold knew this section of the river better than anyone in the valley, having crossed it 1,000 times in warmer months, and he understood that the next few minutes would decide everything. "Daniel, get more people on this rope," Harold called out, his arms already burning from the effort of pulling. "We need every bit of strength we have." Edwin and another neighbor, a quiet man named Peter Lindquist, who had arrived only minutes earlier, after hearing the commotion from his own farm down the road, rushed to grab hold of the rope, adding their strength to the effort. Together, the four men began to haul with everything they had, while Margaret and Clara stood ready with blankets, prepared for the moment Shadow finally reached solid ground. The wolf, still positioned near the horse's head, seemed to understand that this final stretch demanded something more than steady effort. It shifted its weight, bracing itself against the ice, and used its own body as a kind of anchor point, helping to keep Shadow's head above the water as the horse's exhausted legs continued their desperate kicking. "Just a little further," Clara whispered, watching the distance shrink with agonizing slowness. "Come on, Shadow, you can do this." The horse's ears flicked toward the sound of her voice, and for a moment, it seemed as though he recognized her, as though her familiar tone gave him one more reason to keep fighting. His kicks grew stronger, more purposeful, matching the rhythm of the pulling from shore. Then, without warning, a large section of ice near the wolf's position gave way with a thunderous crack, sending the animal sliding sideways into the frigid water. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Clara's hand flew to her mouth in horror as she watched the wolf disappear beneath the surface for a terrifying moment before its head burst back up, gasping, its powerful legs paddling frantically to stay afloat in the freezing current. Margaret cried. Her voice was filled with dread. "It's going to drown." Harold hesitated only a moment, torn between the horse he was actively pulling to safety and the wild animal that had risked everything to help. But there was no time to think it through fully. He shouted instructions to Daniel and the others to keep pulling on Shadow's rope while he moved as close to the edge of safe ice as he dared, searching for any way to help the struggling wolf. The wolf, despite its sudden fall into the icy water, did not panic the way a less experienced creature might have. It turned its body toward the nearest solid ice, using powerful strokes to propel itself forward, its claws scraping against the frozen surface as it searched for a grip that would hold its weight. "Come on," Harold muttered under his breath, watching the animal struggle with a mixture of fear and reluctant admiration. "Come on, you can make it." Clara felt tears freezing against her cheeks as she watched the wolf fight for its own survival, after having spent so much of its strength saving a creature that was not its own kind. The unfairness of it struck her deeply. This animal that had done nothing but help, now facing the very fate it had worked so hard to save Shadow from. The wolf's front paws finally found purchase on a thicker section of ice, and with a powerful heave, it pulled itself up and out of the water, shaking violently to remove the worst of the freezing liquid from its fur. It lay still for a moment, chest heaving, clearly exhausted from the ordeal, before slowly rising back to its feet. "It made it," Daniel breathed, relief flooding through his voice, even as he continued to strain against the rope connected to Shadow. It actually made it out. But the wolf's brief rest did not last long. Despite its own near escape from the icy water, it turned its attention immediately back to Shadow, moving carefully along a new path toward the horse's position, as though its own safety mattered less to it than finishing what it had started. "It's going back," Margaret whispered in disbelief. "After everything, it's going back to help him." Clara watched in stunned silence as the wolf resumed its position near Shadow's head, seemingly unbothered by its own recent brush with the same fate the horse was fighting against. There was something in the animal's persistence that felt almost impossible to comprehend, a determination that seemed to go beyond simple instinct into something that looked remarkably like genuine care. "Pull harder," Harold shouted to the men on the rope, sensing that the horse's strength was beginning to fade after the prolonged struggle. We're almost there. Shadow's legs, though weakening, continued their rhythmic kicking, matched by the steady pull from the shore, and the wolf's continued presence guiding him along the safest path. The distance to solid ground had shrunk to less than 20 feet, close enough now that everyone on the bank could see the exhaustion clearly written across the horse's face. "He's tiring fast," Clara said, worry creasing her forehead as she watched Shadow's movements grow sluggish. "We need to get him out now, before he can't fight anymore." Peter Lindquist, who had said little since arriving, suddenly spoke up. "I've got an idea. If we can get a second rope around his chest, instead of just the halter, we'll have better leverage to pull him up, rather than just forward." Harold nodded quickly, recognizing the wisdom in the suggestion. "Daniel, grab the spare rope from my truck. Hurry." Daniel released his grip on the main rope, trusting the others to hold steady, and sprinted toward Harold's truck parked at the top of the ridge. Every second felt like an eternity, as the remaining men continued to strain against the weight of the horse, the wolf still positioned faithfully near Shadow's head, occasionally nudging the animal forward whenever his movements slowed. Daniel returned moments later, breathless, with a second coil of rope in his hands. Harold quickly fashioned a loop, testing its strength before handing it to Peter, who moved as close to the safe edge of the ice as he dared, preparing to throw the new rope toward the horse's position. "On my signal," Harold said, his eyes fixed on the distance between Shadow and the safer ice. "Now." Peter threw the rope with practiced precision, and this time it landed perfectly across Shadow's back, close enough for the wolf to grab hold of the trailing end and pull it into position around the horse's chest. The animal worked with an almost human level of coordination, adjusting the rope until it sat securely, ready for the final pull. "Everyone, grab hold," Harold shouted, and the entire group, now numbering 6 people, including Clara and Margaret, took hold of both ropes, bracing themselves for the effort that would determine whether Shadow lived or died in these frozen waters. The wolf, sensing the shift in the group's coordinated effort, moved to a position just behind Shadow's head, ready to provide one final push as the ropes tightened and the pulling began in earnest. "Pull!" Harold's voice thundered across the frozen valley, and every person gripping the ropes threw their full strength into the effort, determined to bring the exhausted horse home at last. The rope around Shadow's chest grew taut as 6 sets of hands pulled with everything they had, the cold burning their palms even through thick gloves. The horse let out a strained sound, somewhere between a groan and a gasp, as the sudden pressure around his chest gave him new leverage against the water that had held him captive for what felt like an eternity. "Keep pulling, don't stop now!" Harold's voice was hoarse from shouting, but nobody dared ease their grip. Clara had joined the line, her smaller frame wedged between her father and Margaret, adding whatever strength she could to the collective effort. Her arms ached, her fingers had gone numb inside her gloves, but she refused to let go, refused to be anything less than fully present in the moment that would decide Shadow's fate. The wolf, positioned near the horse's head, timed its movements with the rhythm of the pulling from shore, pushing forward whenever the rope tightened, giving Shadow's body an extra boost precisely when it was needed most. It was as though the animal had studied the mechanics of the rescue and understood exactly how to contribute most effectively. "He's moving," Daniel shouted. Excitement broke through his exhaustion. "Look, he's actually moving toward us." Indeed, Shadow's body had begun to slide across the surface of the broken ice, no longer fighting against unmovable water, but gliding, however slowly, toward the safety of the riverbank. Each pull brought him a few more inches closer, the ice beneath him crackling and groaning, but holding just long enough for the next surge of effort to carry him forward. "Don't slow down," Harold called out, sensing that the final stretch would require every ounce of strength the group had left. "We're so close now." The wolf suddenly shifted its position, moving to Shadow's side rather than his head, using its body to help guide the horse away from a particularly weak section of ice that lay directly in his path. It was a small adjustment, barely noticeable to those pulling from shore, but it made all the difference, steering Shadow around a section that might otherwise have given way beneath his weight. Clara noticed the subtle course correction and felt a fresh wave of amazement wash over her. "It's steering him," she said to her father between labored breaths. "The wolf is actually steering him around the weak spots." Harold nodded, too focused on maintaining his grip on the rope to respond with words, but the recognition in his eyes told Clara that he understood exactly what she meant. This was no accident, no coincidence of animal behavior. This was deliberate, careful, intentional help from a creature that had every reason to simply walk away and let nature take its course. The distance to solid ground had shrunk to less than 10 feet now, and the entire group could see the finish line, could sense that after everything, after all the fear and uncertainty, they might actually succeed in bringing Shadow home safely. One more big pull, Peter said, his voice strained with effort. Everyone, on 3. 1, Harold counted, tightening his grip. 2, Daniel echoed, bracing his feet against the solid ice beneath him. 3. The entire group heaved with every remaining bit of strength they possessed, and Shadow's body surged forward across the last stretch of broken ice, his hooves finally finding solid ground beneath the shallow water near the shore. With a final, desperate lunge, the horse pulled himself up and out of the water entirely, collapsing onto the solid ground at the riverbank, his sides heaving as he gasped for breath. The crowd erupted into cheers and cries of relief, but Clara's eyes remained fixed on the wolf, who had followed Shadow's path across the ice, and now stood at the very edge of the water, watching the horse's collapse with what appeared to be genuine relief of its own. "He's out," Margaret said, tears streaming freely down her face. "He's really out." Harold rushed forward, kneeling beside Shadow, running his hands over the horse's shivering body, checking for any obvious injuries, while speaking softly to calm the animal's continued panic. "You're safe now, boy. You're safe." Clara turned toward the wolf, her heart pounding, with a mixture of gratitude and awe that she had never experienced before in her life. The animal stood at the edge of the ice, its fur soaked and matted from its own earlier fall into the water, watching the scene before it with an expression that seemed almost thoughtful. "Thank you," Clara said softly, though she knew the wolf could not understand her words, only perhaps the tone in which they were spoken. "Thank you for saving him." The wolf's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, and for a brief moment, its eyes met hers directly, a connection that felt far more significant than she could have anticipated from a creature she had been taught her entire life to fear and avoid. But the danger was not entirely over. Shadow, though free from the water, remained in serious distress. His body temperature had dropped dangerously low during his time in the freezing river, and everyone present understood that the next several hours would be critical in determining whether the horse would fully recover from his ordeal. "We need to get him warm immediately," Harold said, already working to wrap the heavy blankets Margaret had brought around Shadow's shivering form. "And we need to get him moving, get his blood circulating properly." Daniel and Peter moved quickly to help, working together to support Shadow's weight as the exhausted horse attempted to stand on legs that trembled violently from cold and exertion. It took several attempts, but eventually, with the combined support of the men around him, Shadow managed to rise unsteadily to his feet. Throughout this entire process, the wolf remained at a respectful distance, watching the humans work to save the horse it had already done so much to rescue. It made no move to approach further, seeming to understand, in whatever way wild creatures understand such things, that its part in this particular rescue had reached its natural conclusion. "What do we do about the wolf?" Daniel asked, glancing nervously toward the animal that had, only hours earlier, been the source of the community's collective fear. Harold paused in his efforts to warm Shadow, looking toward the wolf with an expression that mixed uncertainty with a newfound respect he could not have predicted feeling at the start of this terrifying day. "I don't think it wants anything from us," he said slowly. "I think it just wanted to help." Clara watched the wolf a moment longer, memorizing every detail of its appearance. The scars along its side, that spoke of a hard life survived, the intelligence evident in its steady gaze, the quiet dignity with which it now began to withdraw from the scene it had helped create. As the group focused their full attention back on warming and stabilizing Shadow, the wolf turned and moved slowly back toward the tree line from which it had first emerged, its steps unhurried despite its obvious exhaustion, its form gradually disappearing into the shadows of the forest as evening began to settle over the valley. Nobody tried to stop it. Nobody tried to follow. But every person who had witnessed what happened that day knew, without needing to discuss it aloud, that they had just experienced something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The walk back to the ranch house felt longer than usual, though the distance had not changed. Shadow moved slowly between Harold and Daniel, his legs still weak from the ordeal, his breath visible in thick clouds against the darkening sky. Clara walked alongside them, one hand resting gently on the horse's neck, offering what comfort she could, as they made their way across the frozen fields. Behind them, the small crowd that had gathered at the river slowly dispersed, each person carrying with them a story they would tell for years to come, a story that seemed almost too extraordinary to be believed by anyone who had not witnessed it firsthand. "I still can't process what we just saw," Margaret said, walking beside Clara with a blanket draped over her own shoulders against the biting cold. A wolf, saving a horse. If someone had told me this morning that I would witness something like that, I would have thought them mad. Clara nodded, her mind still racing with images of the wolf's careful movements across the ice, its determination, even after its own fall into the freezing water, its quiet withdrawal once its work was done. "I keep thinking about how it looked at me," she said softly, right before it left. It felt like it understood everything that had just happened. "Animals are smarter than we give them credit for," Peter said, walking a few steps ahead with Daniel, both men still shivering from their prolonged exposure to the cold air near the river. "My grandfather used to tell stories about wild animals helping people in danger. I always thought they were just stories meant to teach children lessons about kindness." "Maybe they weren't just stories," Clara replied, glancing back toward the distant tree line where the wolf had disappeared. "Maybe some of them were true, just like this." By the time they reached the ranch house, the sky had darkened fully, and stars had begun to emerge above the mountains surrounding the valley. Harold and Daniel led Shadow into the warmest section of the barn, working quickly to dry his coat with thick towels, while Clara prepared a hot mash of grain and warm water to help restore the horse's strength. "His breathing sounds better," Harold observed, pressing his hand against Shadow's chest to monitor the rhythm of his heartbeat. "But we'll need to watch him closely tonight. The cold can do damage that doesn't show up right away." Clara nodded, understanding the seriousness of her father's words. She had grown up around horses her entire life, had learned from an early age how fragile these powerful animals could be despite their apparent strength. The night ahead would be a long one, filled with careful monitoring and quiet prayers that Shadow's body would recover fully from what it had endured. As the evening wore on, neighbors continued to stop by the ranch, drawn by the news that had spread quickly through the valley despite the late hour. Each visitor arrived with the same mixture of relief and disbelief, eager to hear the details of the rescue directly from those who had witnessed it, and equally eager to check on Shadow's condition with their own eyes. "I heard the wolf actually pulled the rope with its teeth," said an older rancher named Walter Abernathy, shaking his head in amazement as he stood near the barn entrance. "In all my years in this valley, I've never heard of anything like it." "It's true," Daniel confirmed, still slightly in awe himself, as he recounted the events for what felt like the 10th time that evening. "It moved across that ice, like it knew exactly where it was safe to step, and when it fell in itself, it didn't panic. It just kept working, until it got the horse free." Walter's expression grew thoughtful. "There's an old wolf that's been seen around these parts for the better part of a year now. Some folks call it Old Gray, on account of the color along its back. Always alone, always keeping its distance. I always figured it was just passing through, but maybe it's been watching this valley longer than any of us realized." Clara listened to this exchange with growing interest, filing away the information about the wolf's apparent history in the area. Somehow, knowing that this remarkable creature had a name, even an informal one given by the community, made the entire experience feel even more significant, transforming a chance encounter into something that felt more like the continuation of an ongoing story. As the visitors eventually began to make their way home for the night, promising to return the following day to check on Shadow's recovery, Clara found herself standing alone near the barn entrance, looking out toward the dark tree line where the wolf had vanished hours earlier. "Do you think it will come back?" she asked, when her father joined her a few minutes later, having finished settling Shadow into a warm stall lined with fresh hay. Harold considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't know," he admitted. "Wild animals don't usually stick around after something like this, but then again, nothing about today has followed the rules I thought I understood about wild animals." "I hope it does," Clara said quietly. "I never got the chance to properly thank it." Her father placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes the best way to thank a creature like that is simply to remember what it did, and to treat its kind with more respect and understanding going forward." Clara nodded, understanding the wisdom in her father's words. though a part of her still longed for the chance to see the wolf again, to somehow communicate the depth of her gratitude for what it had done for her family that day. Inside the barn, Shadow shifted restlessly in his stall, still recovering from the trauma of his ordeal, but breathing more steadily now that he was warm and dry. Clara moved to check on him one final time, before heading inside for the night, running her hand gently along his neck as she whispered soft words of comfort. "You're safe now," she murmured. "Thanks to a friend none of us expected." As she finally made her way toward the house, exhaustion setting in after the intensity of the day's events, Clara cast one last glance toward the distant tree line, half expecting to see a pair of watchful eyes reflecting back at her from the darkness. But the forest remained still and silent, giving no indication of the remarkable creature that had disappeared into its depths hours earlier. The night passed slowly for the Whitfield family, punctuated by regular checks on Shadow's condition and quiet conversations about the impossible events they had witnessed. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the lingering adrenaline of the day and the persistent wonder at what they had all experienced together. By morning, word of the rescue had spread throughout the entire valley and beyond, carried by phone calls and hurried conversations between neighbors, eager to share what they had heard. The story of the wolf that saved a drowning horse had become, almost overnight, the most talked-about event the valley had seen in years. But for Clara, the story felt far from finished. Something told her that her connection with the mysterious wolf, the creature some now called Old Grey, was only just beginning. Morning arrived with a pale golden light spreading slowly across the frozen valley, and Clara woke before dawn, unable to sleep any longer despite the exhaustion still weighing heavily on her body. Her first thought was of Shadow, and she hurried to the barn to check on his condition, before even stopping for breakfast. She found her father already there, having apparently spent much of the night monitoring the horse's recovery. Shadow stood in his stall, still favoring his weakened legs slightly, but his breathing had returned to normal, and his eyes, once wide with terror, now held their familiar calm intelligence. "How is he?" Clara asked, moving to stroke the horse's neck gently. "Better than I expected," Harold replied, relief evident in his voice, despite the fatigue lining his face. "His temperature is back to normal, and he ate most of the mash we gave him overnight. I think he's going to make a full recovery." Clara felt a wave of gratitude wash over her, so powerful that tears sprang to her eyes, despite her best efforts to remain composed. "Thank goodness," she whispered, pressing her forehead gently against Shadow's neck. The horse nuzzled against her in response, seeming to understand, in his own way, the depth of concern that had surrounded his recovery through the long night. Harold watched the exchange between his daughter and their beloved horse, with quiet satisfaction, grateful beyond words that the previous day's events had ended with survival rather than tragedy. "I want to go looking for the wolf," Clara said suddenly, breaking the peaceful silence that had settled over the barn. Harold raised an eyebrow, considering his daughter's request carefully. "That could be dangerous, Clara. Wild animals, even ones that have shown unusual behavior, are still wild animals. We can't assume it will react the same way twice." "I'm not asking to approach it or try to touch it," Clara clarified. "I just want to see if it's all right. It fell into that water too, remember? What if it's hurt somewhere out there?" Her father's expression softened slightly at this concern, recognizing the genuine compassion behind his daughter's request, rather than simple curiosity or excitement. "All right," he agreed finally. "But we go together, and we keep our distance. If we see it, we observe from far away. We don't approach." Clara nodded eagerly, grateful for her father's understanding, and the two of them prepared for a careful search of the area near the tree line, where the wolf had last been seen disappearing into the forest the previous evening. The walk toward the woods felt different in the morning light than it had during the panic and chaos of the previous day. The frozen river, now visible without the desperate urgency that had surrounded it hours earlier, showed clear evidence of the dramatic rescue that had taken place across its surface. Broken sections of ice, refrozen overnight into jagged, uneven patterns, marked the path where Shadow had struggled, and where the wolf had carefully navigated its way to help him. "It's strange to see it now," Clara said quietly, studying the frozen scene before them. "Yesterday it felt like the most dangerous place in the world. Today it just looks like an ordinary river." Harold nodded in agreement, understanding the strange shift in perspective that came with reflecting on danger after it had passed. They continued their careful walk along the edge of the tree line, scanning the shadows beneath the pine branches for any sign of movement, any indication that the wolf might still be nearby. After nearly 20 minutes of quiet searching, Clara suddenly grabbed her father's arm, pointing toward a small clearing a short distance ahead. "There," she whispered urgently. "Do you see it?" Harold followed her gaze, and immediately spotted what had caught his daughter's attention. The wolf lay curled beneath a fallen log, partially hidden by low-hanging branches, its body still and quiet, in a way that immediately raised concern in both their minds. "Is it hurt?" Clara asked, her voice tight with worry as they approached slightly closer, though still maintaining a respectful distance from the resting animal. As if sensing their presence, the wolf's head lifted slowly, its eyes opening to regard the approaching humans with the same steady intelligence Clara remembered from the previous day. It did not rise immediately, seeming to conserve its remaining energy, but its posture suggested exhaustion rather than serious injury. "I think it's just tired," Harold observed quietly, keeping his voice low to avoid startling the animal. What it did yesterday would have exhausted even the strongest predator. Falling into that freezing water on top of everything else certainly didn't help. Clara felt her heart ache with sympathy for the creature that had given so much to save a horse it had no reason to protect. "Can we do anything for it?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer, based on her father's earlier warnings about maintaining distance from wild animals. "We can't approach it directly," Harold said gently, "but perhaps we could leave some food nearby, something that might help it regain its strength without requiring us to get too close." Clara considered this suggestion, remembering that she had grabbed some extra provisions before leaving the ranch house that morning, anticipating the possibility that they might encounter the wolf during their search. She carefully retrieved a wrapped portion of meat from her bag, moving slowly and deliberately as she placed it on the ground a reasonable distance from where the wolf rested, close enough for the animal to reach easily once they had withdrawn, but far enough to avoid any sense of threat or confrontation. "There," she said softly, stepping back to rejoin her father. "That should help, at least a little." The wolf watched this entire exchange with careful attention, its eyes tracking Clara's movements without any sign of aggression or fear, an unusual calmness that continued to surprise both Whitfields, given everything they had been taught about wild animal behavior throughout their lives. As they began to withdraw, giving the exhausted wolf space to rest, and eventually approach the food they had left, Clara paused for one final look at the remarkable creature that had changed her family's fortune so dramatically. "Thank you," she said one more time, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet clearing. "For everything you did yesterday." The wolf's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, and for a brief moment, its gaze seemed to hold hers, with something that felt remarkably like acknowledgement, a connection that transcended the usual boundaries between human and wild animal. Then, slowly, Clara and her father turned and made their way back toward the ranch, leaving the wolf to its rest and recovery, both of them carrying with them a profound sense that they had witnessed something extraordinary, something that would shape their understanding of the natural world for the rest of their lives. As they walked, Clara found herself already wondering whether this encounter marked the beginning of something more, some deeper connection between her family and the mysterious wolf that had saved Shadow, or whether it would remain simply a singular moment of unexpected grace in an otherwise ordinary winter. Little did she know, the coming days would bring answers to these questions in ways she could never have anticipated. 3 days passed since the dramatic rescue, and Shadow's recovery continued steadily, much to the relief of the entire Whitfield family. The horse had regained most of his strength, walking with confidence around the barn, and showing renewed interest in his usual grain and hay, though Harold insisted on keeping him confined to the warmer stalls until the coldest part of winter had fully passed. Clara had returned to the clearing near the tree line, each morning since their initial discovery of the resting wolf, always accompanied by her father, always maintaining a careful distance, while leaving small offerings of food nearby. On each visit, they found the previous offering had been consumed, though the wolf itself remained elusive, visible only occasionally at a distance, watching from the shadows, before disappearing deeper into the forest. "Do you think it's following us on purpose?" Clara asked one morning, as they made their way back from another visit to the clearing. "It always seems to know when we're coming." Harold considered the question thoughtfully. Wolves have incredible senses of smell and hearing. It probably knows we're approaching long before we ever see it. Whether it's choosing to stay nearby or simply hasn't moved on yet, I honestly couldn't say. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of an approaching vehicle, and they turned to see Walter Abernathy's truck pulling up near the ranch house, the older rancher stepping out with an expression that suggested he had news to share. "Harold, Clara," Walter greeted them, tipping his hat slightly despite the cold. "I thought you'd want to know. Some folks over on the eastern side of the valley have been talking about setting up a hunting party." Clara felt her stomach drop at these words. A hunting party? For what? Walter's expression turned grim. "There's been talk that a wolf attacked some livestock over near the Hendricks farm 2 nights ago. Killed a couple of sheep. Given everything that happened here, some folks are wondering if it's the same wolf, and they're saying it needs to be dealt with before it causes more damage." "That can't be right," Clara said immediately, her voice rising with distress. "The wolf that helped us wouldn't attack livestock. It saved Shadow's life. It nearly drowned itself trying to help him." "I understand your feelings, Clara," Walter said gently, "but not everyone in the valley witnessed what happened here firsthand. Some folks only know the wolf as a predator, and predators sometimes attack livestock, regardless of any unusual behavior they might have shown once." Harold placed a calming hand on his daughter's shoulder, sensing her rising agitation. "Walter, do we know for certain it's the same wolf? Could be an entirely different animal, especially if there's been more than one wolf moving through this area." "That's hard to say for certain," Walter admitted, "but given the description the Hendricks family gave, gray and white coloring, similar size, it does sound consistent with what folks have described from your rescue." Clara's mind raced with conflicting thoughts. She desperately wanted to believe that the wolf they had come to care for, the creature that had shown such remarkable compassion toward Shadow, could not possibly be responsible for attacking innocent livestock. But she also understood that wild animals, regardless of any single act of unusual behavior, remained wild animals, driven by instincts and needs that humans could never fully understand or predict. "We need to find out the truth before anyone does anything drastic," Clara said firmly, looking between her father and Walter with determination. "If people are planning to hunt this wolf based on assumptions, we need to make sure those assumptions are actually correct." Harold nodded slowly, understanding his daughter's concern, while also recognizing the complexity of the situation before them. "Walter, when is this hunting party supposed to gather?" "Talk is, they're planning to head out tomorrow morning," Walter replied. "Figured you'd want fair warning, given your family's connection to this whole situation." After Walter departed, promising to keep them updated on any further developments, Clara turned to her father with an urgent request, written clearly across her face. "We have to do something. We can't just let them hunt down the wolf that saved Shadow's life, not without knowing for certain it's actually responsible for what happened at the Hendricks farm." "What exactly do you propose we do?" Harold asked, though his tone suggested he was already searching for a solution alongside his daughter, rather than dismissing her concerns. "I think we should visit the Hendricks farm ourselves," Clara suggested. "See the scene where the attack happened, maybe look for evidence that could tell us more about what really occurred there. If it's a different wolf, or even coyotes, we need to know that before anyone makes a decision that can't be undone." Harold considered this proposal carefully, recognizing both the reasonableness of the suggestion and the potential risk involved in getting more deeply entangled in what was quickly becoming a contentious issue within the Valley community. "All right," he said finally. "We'll drive over there this afternoon and see what we can learn." The drive to the Hendricks farm took nearly 30 minutes, winding through familiar roads that connected the scattered ranches throughout the valley. When they arrived, they found Gerald Hendricks, the farm's owner, examining the fenced enclosure where his sheep were kept, his expression grim as he assessed the damage from the recent attack. "Harold, Clara," Gerald greeted them, somewhat surprised by their visit. "I imagine you've heard about what happened here." "We have," Harold confirmed. "We wanted to see if we might be able to help understand what occurred, given our own recent experience with a wolf in this valley." Gerald led them toward the section of fence where the attack had taken place, pointing out torn sections of wire and scattered evidence of the struggle that had occurred 2 nights earlier. Clara studied the scene carefully, noting details that seemed inconsistent with what she had observed of the wolf that had helped save Shadow. "These tracks," she said slowly, kneeling down to examine paw prints preserved in the frozen mud near the fence line. "They look smaller than what I remember from the wolf at the river. and there seemed to be multiple sets here, not just one animal. Gerald looked closer at the tracks Clara had identified, his expression shifting from certainty to uncertainty. I hadn't considered that possibility. I just assumed, given the recent talk about a wolf in the area, that it must be connected. Harold knelt beside his daughter, examining the tracks with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades reading signs left behind by wild animals on his own property. Clara's right. These tracks are smaller, and there's definitely more than one set here. This looks more consistent with coyotes than a lone wolf. The relief that flooded through Clara at this discovery was immediate and profound. So it wasn't the wolf that saved Shadow. It was coyotes, a whole group of them, probably looking for an easy meal during the coldest part of winter. Gerald nodded slowly, absorbing this new information with a mixture of relief and embarrassment at having potentially contributed to a dangerous misunderstanding. I should let the others know before that hunting party heads out tomorrow. We can't let them go after an innocent animal based on a mistaken assumption. Please, Clara said urgently, let them know as soon as possible. That wolf doesn't deserve to be hunted for something it didn't do, especially after everything it did for our family. As Gerald hurried toward his house to begin making calls to the other ranchers involved in the planned hunting expedition, Clara felt a wave of relief mixed with continued anxiety, aware that misunderstandings, once spread through a community, did not always resolve as quickly or completely as the truth deserved. The drive back to their own ranch felt heavier with unspoken tension, both Clara and her father understanding that they had helped prevent a potential tragedy, but also recognizing that the danger to the wolf and the community's uncertain feelings about its presence in the valley remained far from fully resolved. Despite Gerald's efforts to spread the news about the coyote tracks discovered at his farm, not everyone in the valley proved willing to abandon their plans so easily. Word reached Harold and Clara the following morning that while some ranchers had called off their involvement in the hunting party, a small group, led by a stubborn and skeptical man named Franklin Odell, still intended to proceed with their search for the wolf. Franklin's never been one to change his mind easily, even when the facts point clearly in another direction, Harold said grimly, after receiving a phone call from Walter, informing them of this development. He's convinced that any wolf in the area poses a threat to his livestock, regardless of what evidence suggests otherwise. Clara felt a fresh surge of anxiety at this news. We have to stop them. If they find that wolf, especially while it's still recovering from everything it went through helping Shadow, they might not give it any chance to prove its innocence. I agree, Harold said, already reaching for his coat. Let's head over to where Walter said the hunting party was planning to gather. Maybe we can convince Franklin and the others to reconsider before they cause any real harm. The drive to the gathering point took them to a section of road near the eastern edge of the valley, where several trucks were already parked, and a small group of armed men stood discussing their planned route into the forest where the wolf had last been sighted. Franklin Odell, a broad-shouldered man with a perpetually stern expression, stood at the center of the group, examining a map spread across the hood of his truck. Franklin, Harold called out as they approached, we need to talk before you head out there. Franklin looked up, his expression skeptical but not entirely dismissive. Harold, Clara, I heard you found some coyote tracks over at the Hendricks place. That's fine and good, but it doesn't change the fact that there's still a wolf running loose in this valley, and wolves have a way of causing problems eventually, even if they haven't yet. This particular wolf saved my horse's life, Clara said firmly, stepping forward, despite her nervousness, at addressing the group of armed men directly. It risked its own safety, nearly drowned itself, all to help an animal it had no connection to whatsoever. Doesn't that count for something? Franklin's expression softened slightly, though skepticism remained evident in his eyes. I heard the stories, Clara. It's a remarkable tale, I'll give you that. But one act of unusual behavior doesn't erase the basic nature of a wild predator. We can't put the safety of this entire valley's livestock at risk, based on a single incident, however extraordinary it might have been. But you're willing to risk killing an animal that's done nothing wrong, based on assumptions rather than actual evidence, Harold countered, his voice steady but firm. The tracks at the Hendricks farm point clearly to coyotes, not a lone wolf. If you go out there and find that wolf, what exactly do you plan to do? The question hung in the cold morning air, and several of the men in the group exchanged uncertain glances, clearly less committed to Franklin's determination than their leader appeared to be. I say we let it be, said one of the men, a younger rancher Clara recognized as someone who had been present at the river during the original rescue. "I saw what that wolf did with my own eyes. It's not right to go hunting it down after everything it did for the Whitfield family." Franklin's jaw tightened, clearly frustrated by the growing dissent within his own hunting party. "So we just let a wolf roam free in our valley, trusting that it will continue behaving unusually forever? What happens the first time it's hungry and there's no dramatic rescue opportunity? Just an easy meal in the form of someone's livestock." "What happens," Clara said, her voice gaining strength as conviction replaced her initial nervousness, "is that we treat it the way we'd want to be treated, if the situation were reversed. We give it the benefit of the doubt, especially when the actual evidence, the tracks, the pattern of behavior, all points toward its innocence rather than guilt." A tense silence fell over the group as Clara's words settled among them. Franklin studied her carefully, clearly weighing her passionate argument against his own deeply held concerns about protecting the valley's livestock and community safety. "All right," Franklin said finally, his tone still gruff, but noticeably less confrontational than before. "We'll hold off on actively hunting the wolf for now, but if there's any further incident, any evidence at all connecting it to attacks on livestock, we reserve the right to reconsider." Clara felt a flood of relief wash through her, though she recognized this was a compromise, rather than a complete resolution. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "I truly believe you won't regret this decision." As the hunting party slowly began to disperse, some of the men returning to their trucks while others lingered to discuss the unexpected turn of events, Harold placed a proud hand on his daughter's shoulder. "That took real courage," he said quietly. "Standing up to Franklin O'Dell isn't something most people in this valley are willing to do." "I couldn't just stay silent," Clara replied, still processing the intensity of the confrontation she had just navigated. "Not when that wolf's life was on the line for something it didn't even do." As they made their way back to their truck, preparing for the drive home, Clara noticed something that made her pause. Standing at the edge of the tree line, partially obscured by shadows but unmistakably present, was the wolf itself, watching the scene that had just unfolded from a safe distance. "Dad, look," she whispered, pointing carefully toward the tree line. Harold followed her gaze and spotted the same watchful presence his daughter had identified. The wolf stood perfectly still, its eyes fixed on the dispersing hunting party, seeming to understand, in whatever manner wild creatures process such complex situations, that its immediate future had just been decided by the humans gathered nearby. "Do you think it heard everything we said?" Clara asked softly, unable to look away from the distant animal. "I don't know," Harold admitted, "but something tells me it understands more about what happened here today than we might expect." As the last of the hunting party's trucks pulled away, the wolf remained at the tree line for several more moments, its gaze shifting briefly toward Clara and Harold before it finally turned and disappeared once more into the depths of the forest, leaving behind two humans who felt, more strongly than ever, that they had formed an unlikely but genuine connection with this remarkable creature. Weeks passed following the tense confrontation with Franklin O'Dell's hunting party, and the valley gradually settled back into its usual winter rhythms. Shadow had made a complete recovery, his strength fully restored, and he once again carried Clara across the snow-covered fields, with the same confidence he had always shown before the accident that nearly claimed his life. The story of the wolf's rescue had spread far beyond the boundaries of the valley, carried by word of mouth to neighboring communities, and eventually reaching a local newspaper reporter named Victoria Lang, who arrived at the Whitfield Ranch one crisp February morning, seeking to document the remarkable events firsthand. "I've heard several different versions of this story," Victoria explained, sitting across from Clara and Harold at their kitchen table, notebook ready to record their account. "I wanted to hear it directly from the people who witnessed it, rather than relying on second-hand rumors that may have grown more exaggerated with each retelling." Clara found herself recounting the entire experience in careful detail, from the initial panic of discovering Shadow trapped in the icy river, to the wolf's remarkable intervention, and the tense days that followed, as misunderstandings nearly led to tragedy for the very creature that had shown such unexpected compassion. "It's an extraordinary story," Victoria said, once Clara had finished her account. "Do you have any theories about why the wolf might have acted this way? Wolves aren't typically known for this kind of behavior toward other species, especially not toward animals as large and potentially dangerous as a horse." Harold considered the question thoughtfully, before responding. I've spent my whole life around animals, and I've learned that we still understand far less about their inner lives than we like to believe. Maybe this particular wolf had experiences we don't know about. Maybe it simply possessed an unusual level of empathy that we don't typically associate with wild predators. Either way, what matters most to us is that it saved our horse's life, and it did so at genuine risk to its own safety. Victoria nodded, jotting down notes as Harold spoke. There have been a few documented cases throughout history of wild animals engaging in what appears to be altruistic behavior toward other species. Scientists still debate exactly what drives such behavior, whether it's genuine empathy, some form of learned association, or something else entirely that we don't yet fully understand. Whatever the reason, Clara added, I know what I witnessed. That wolf didn't have to help Shadow. It could have simply watched from a distance, or even walked away entirely. Instead, it risked its own life, not once, but twice, first crossing that dangerous ice, and then again when it fell into the water itself, but immediately went back to finish helping him. As their conversation continued, Clara found herself sharing details about the days following the rescue, the careful visits to check on the wolf's recovery, and the tense standoff with the hunting party that had nearly ended in tragedy for the very creature that deserved gratitude rather than persecution. It sounds like this experience has changed how your entire community views wolves, Victoria observed, looking between Clara and her father with evident interest. Has there been any lasting shift in attitude since these events occurred? Harold considered this question carefully. I think so, at least among those who witnessed what happened, or heard the story directly from reliable sources. There will always be people like Franklin Odell, who remain cautious or skeptical, regardless of evidence. And that caution isn't necessarily wrong, given the genuine risks wild animals can pose. But I believe most people in this valley now view wolves with a bit more nuance, understanding that individual animals, like individual humans, are capable of surprising us. The interview continued for another hour, with Victoria asking increasingly detailed questions about the specific mechanics of the rescue, the community's reaction, and the ongoing presence of the wolf in the area surrounding their ranch. By the time she finally departed, promising to send them a copy of the finished article once it was published, both Clara and Harold felt a renewed sense of significance about the events they had experienced. Do you think people outside the valley will actually believe this story? Clara asked her father after Victoria's car had disappeared down the long driveway leading away from their ranch. Some will, some won't, Harold replied philosophically. But the truth of what happened doesn't depend on whether strangers believe it. We know what we saw, and Shadow is alive today because of it. That evening, as the sun began to set behind the mountains surrounding their valley, Clara made her way once more toward the familiar clearing near the tree line, carrying with her a small offering of food as she had done regularly over the past several weeks. Though sightings of the wolf had become less frequent as winter progressed, she continued this ritual, hoping that somewhere in the depths of the forest, the remarkable creature that had changed her family's fortune remained safe and healthy. As she approached the clearing, she noticed something different this time. Rather than simply leaving her offering and departing as usual, she caught sight of movement at the edge of her vision, and turning slowly, she found herself face to face with the wolf itself, standing only a short distance away, watching her with the same steady, intelligent gaze she remembered from that fateful day at the river. Clara's heart raced, though not from fear, but from a profound sense of connection with this creature that had given so much to protect a life that mattered deeply to her family. She remained perfectly still, unwilling to startle the wolf or cause it to retreat prematurely. "Hello," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been hoping to see you again." The wolf did not approach closer, maintaining a respectful distance that seemed to acknowledge the fundamental boundary between wild and domestic worlds, but neither did it flee. Instead, it simply watched her for several long moments, its gaze steady and calm, before slowly lowering itself to sit at the edge of the clearing, seemingly content to remain in her presence for a while longer. Clara felt tears gathering in her eyes, overwhelmed by the simple beauty of this quiet moment shared between herself and the extraordinary animal that had risked everything to save a life it had no obligation to protect. She understood, in this instant, that some connections transcended the usual boundaries of species and circumstance, forming bonds that defied easy explanation, but felt undeniably real. "Thank you," she said again, the words feeling inadequate to capture the depth of her gratitude, but sincere nonetheless. For everything you did, and for everything you continue to represent to our family. The wolf remained still for a moment longer, before rising slowly to its feet, offering one final steady look toward Clara, before turning and disappearing gracefully into the shadows of the forest, leaving her alone in the quiet clearing, with a heart full of wonder and appreciation for the unexpected gift this remarkable creature had brought into her life. Spring arrived gradually in the valley, melting away the last remnants of the harsh winter that had brought such unexpected drama to the Whitfield Ranch months earlier. The frozen river that had nearly claimed Shadow's life now flowed freely again, its waters clear and calm, betraying no evidence of the dramatic rescue that had unfolded across its surface during the coldest days of winter. Clara often found herself returning to that same stretch of riverbank, not out of any lingering fear or trauma, but rather out of a deep sense of reflection on everything that had transpired there. Shadow, fully recovered and stronger than ever, now grazed peacefully in the fields nearby, his presence a constant reminder of both the danger they had faced and the remarkable rescue that had saved him. Victoria Lang's article had eventually been published, spreading the story of the wolf's heroic rescue to readers far beyond the boundaries of their small valley community. The response had been overwhelming, with letters and messages arriving from people across the region and beyond, many sharing their own experiences with wild animals that had defied conventional expectations of predatory behavior. "I never expected our story to reach so many people," Clara said one afternoon, sitting with her father on the porch of their ranch house, reading through some of the recent correspondence that had arrived in response to the published article. "Stories about compassion and unexpected connection tend to resonate deeply with people," Harold replied, setting aside a letter from a family in a distant state, who had written to share their own encounter with a similarly unusual wild animal. "Perhaps because they remind us that kindness can appear in the most unlikely forms, if we remain open enough to recognize it." The wolf itself had continued to make occasional appearances throughout the following months, always maintaining its characteristic distance, never seeking direct interaction beyond the quiet moments of mutual observation that had become almost a tradition between the creature and the Whitfield family. Local ranchers, having heard the full story and witnessed no further incidents of livestock predation attributable to the animal, had largely come to accept its presence in the valley as a unique and welcome addition to their community, rather than the threat many had initially feared. Franklin Odell himself had gradually softened his stance, particularly after several months passed without any further evidence connecting the wolf to livestock losses. He had even, on one occasion that surprised everyone who heard about it, personally apologized to Clara for his initial reluctance to accept the truth about the animal's innocent nature. "I suppose I let my fears get ahead of the actual facts," Franklin had admitted during a chance encounter at the local feed store. "That wolf's done nothing but prove itself since that whole incident happened. Guess sometimes we all need a reminder that things aren't always as simple as they first appear." As summer approached and the valley bloomed with new life, Clara found herself reflecting often on the profound lessons she had learned through her family's unexpected connection with the wolf that had saved Shadow's life. She had come to understand that courage and compassion were not qualities exclusive to any single species, that the natural world held mysteries and wonders, far beyond what most people typically recognized or acknowledged in their daily lives. One particularly warm evening in early June, as Clara walked along the familiar path toward the tree line, carrying with her the small offering that had become such an established part of her routine over the preceding months, she paused at the edge of the clearing, taking in the peaceful beauty of the scene before her. The wolf appeared, as it often did during these visits, emerging from the shadows with the same quiet dignity that had characterized every previous encounter between them. But this time, something felt different, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that Clara could not quite identify at first. As she watched, the wolf moved closer than it ever had before, close enough that Clara could see clearly the details of its weathered face, the intelligence evident in its steady eyes, the quiet strength that had once carried it across dangerous ice to save a life that mattered so deeply to her family. "You've never come this close before," Clara whispered, remaining perfectly still, unwilling to disrupt whatever remarkable moment was unfolding between them. The wolf regarded her for several long, silent moments, and then, in an act that would remain etched in Clara's memory for the rest of her life, it lowered its head slightly, a gesture that felt unmistakably like acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude for the consistent care and respect she had shown it throughout the preceding months. Then, as gracefully as it had first appeared in her life, that fateful winter day at the river, the wolf turned and disappeared once more into the forest, leaving Clara alone, with an overwhelming sense of connection and wonder that she knew would stay with her forever. She never saw the wolf again after that particular evening, though she continued her visits to the clearing for many months afterward, always hoping for one more glimpse of the remarkable creature that had changed her family's understanding of the natural world so profoundly. Eventually, she came to accept that the wolf had likely moved on, perhaps continuing its solitary journey through other territories, or perhaps simply choosing to retreat further into the depths of the wilderness that had always been its true home. But the impact of what that wolf had done, and what it had represented, remained a permanent part of the valley's collective memory. Years later, ranchers would still tell the story to their children, a tale of the winter when a wild wolf saved a drowning horse, risking its own life not once but twice, asking for nothing in return, beyond the simple dignity of being understood rather than feared. Shadow lived many more years on the Whitfield Ranch, growing old and gray, but never losing the spark of life that had nearly been extinguished in those freezing waters. Clara often found herself telling his story to visitors who came to admire the aging horse, always careful to include the crucial detail of the wolf's remarkable intervention, ensuring that the truth of what happened would never be forgotten or diminished by time. And somewhere out in the vast wilderness beyond the valley's boundaries, perhaps the wolf continued its solitary existence, carrying within it whatever remarkable capacity for compassion had driven it to risk everything for a creature it had never known before that fateful winter day. Whether such actions stemmed from instinct, learned behavior, or something more profound that science had yet to fully explain, the truth of what occurred that day remained undeniable and unforgettable. The valley had changed because of what happened on that frozen river, not dramatically or obviously, but in the quiet, meaningful way that comes from witnessing genuine goodness where none was expected. The people who lived there carried with them, for the rest of their lives, a deeper understanding that the world remained full of surprises, that courage and kindness could emerge from the most unlikely sources, and that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism came not from those we expect to be heroes, but from those we have spent our lives learning, mistakenly, to fear.